Joseph Big Joey Massino was the legendary godfather of the Bonnano crime family. To the FBI, he was known as the Last Don. He absolutely crushed anyone who went against the Mafia code of Omerta.
Joe Massino was considered the last Don because he was really the last of the old guard.
He was feared absolutely because he was a violent man, and his reputation preceded him.
Loyalty to his family and obedience to their code of silence was everything, and he was determined to keep it that way, going to any extreme to protect his secrets.
Joe Massino would not speak in a group setting. If he wanted to talk criminal activity, he would walk outside with at least one person, maybe two. He would walk around the block. He would put his hands over his lips to avoid any type of recording that a lip reader could possibly translate.
When the family was infiltrated by the legendary undercover agent Donnie Brasco, it spelled the end for the Bonannos and for the Mafia. But the Last Don refused to cooperate, causing big problems for the feds.
Joe Massino threatened people with death.
Massino was the key to the family. So what I had to do was find the key to Massino.
I never thought Joe Massino would cooperate.
But when Massino finally went down for good, he'd take everyone with him, like no other Mafia boss had ever done before him. This is Mafia. On August 14th, 1981, Sonny Black Napolitano went to one of his regular hangouts in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. He was a captain in the Bonnano family, and the Motion Lounge was one of their headquarters. Sonny walked up to the barman and handed him the keys to his apartment, a big stash of cash, and the diamond-encrusted rings from his fingers. He told the barman that he was going to a meeting and that he didn't know if he was coming back. Big Joey Massino, at the time a powerful Bonnano underboss, had taken out a contract on Sonny. Tony DeStefano is the author of King of American Godfathers.
Sonny Black was taken to a house ordered to a meeting in a house in Staten Island, was pushed into the basement and was killed and shot several times. And he knew what was happening. And supposedly his last words were, if you're going to do it, make it good and make it quick, basically. And he was taken out, buried in a place on Staten Island, and some months later his body was discovered quite by chance. And that was the end of Sonny Black.
Sonny Black's mistake had been consequential and unforgivable. He had fallen for the cover story of FBI Special Agent Joe Pistone, who's better known as Donnie Brasco.
Donnie Brasco was the stage name for Special Agent Joseph Pistone of the FBI. Pistone was the fellow who in the late 1970s and early 1980s penetrated the Bonnano crime family by posing as Donnie Brasco, a sort of two-bit thief, guy who dealt in stolen property and jewels and ingratiated himself with the crime family. And he was able to dispose of stolen property because he had the FBI secretly working with him to dispose of the property and provide him with cash as a way of showing, results. So the crime family became to look upon Joe Pistone, Donnie Brasco, as somebody who was very valuable.
Not only had he believed the undercover agent, but Sonny Black had taken him under his wing and helped him rise in the Mafia ranks. Black was the most senior member to be deceived, and for 6 years he allowed Brasco access to the Bonnano family's dirtiest secrets. Former FBI Special Agent Pat Colgan.
He gathered tremendous intelligence information by just being able to transfer what he was learning to his contacts in the FBI, who were trying to determine what members of the Bonnano organized crime family were planning in the future. He was a phenomenal asset for the FBI in the area of criminal activities and organized crime.
Joe Pistone's undercover work was so credible and so good Sonny Black and Brasco became close friends. Sonny Black even recommended Brasco for induction into the Bonnano family as a made man. Hey, Mafia fans! Here's a secret I just can't stay silent about. We have officially launched a merch store, and it's live on Audioboom right now. If you love Mafia and want to show your support, head over to audioboom.com/merch/Mafia. You can buy a nice mug, a phone case that the FBI hasn't tapped, or a journal to keep a list of people you can trust, or maybe those you can't. You'll be as stylish as Lucky Luciano. Be sure to keep an eye on the store as new designs and products get added regularly. That's audioboom.com/merch/Mafia. Thanks for your support. Selwyn Rabb is the author of 5 Families.
Napolitano had taken Pistone in almost as one of his right-hand men, and he wanted him to be inducted as a made soldier. The idea that an FBI agent could infiltrate and almost become a made member was unbelievable.
But once the truth was known, Massino didn't take it lightly. Not only were they humiliated and compromised, but this revelation could bring down the entire Bonnano crime organization. And in Massino's mind, this disaster rested squarely on Sonny Black's shoulders.
This was an unbelievable sin, and Napolitano was the first victim of the purge. He was bumped off, whacked almost immediately after Pistone surfaced. One of the events that came out of Pistone's infiltration was that it led to Joe Massino becoming an important player in the Bonnano family.
For years, the Bonnano crime family had been mistrusted by the other families. An old boss, Carmine Galante, had tried to take over their rackets in his quest to become the boss of all bosses, which didn't sit well with the rest of the families. When Galante was killed in 1979, Joe Massino had started building a successful family on the foundations of secrecy and loyalty. But by trusting Pistone, Sonny Black had undone everything, and Black's death was only the beginning. Massino also put a hit on Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero, who had also helped Pistone along. But Ruggiero was arrested before he could be assassinated. A third man was not so lucky. Anthony Mira had introduced Brasco to Sonny Black. Determined to make the point that loyalty is more important than blood, Massino ordered the execution to be carried out by Mira's cousin, crime author Tony DiStefano.
Well, I think the murders that you saw in the Bonnano crime family, beginning with Sonny Black and the others, was definitely an indication of how ruthless and businesslike Massino could be. And I also think some of the murders that he took part in or inspired were his way of cleaning house, trying to get rid of people who might be able to implicate him in the very murders he was involved in and sort of other crimes he was taking part in.
Massino was trying to put things back in order, but the lasting damage had already been done. Brasco's information was enough to indict 6 of the Bonannos members on charges of murder. Massino himself was convicted for racketeering and sentenced to 10 years in jail.
So the Bonnano families were looked upon as undesirables by everybody else in the New York and national mafia. Pistone's infiltration almost completely destroyed the Bonnano family. Nobody wanted to deal with them anymore. They were so untrustworthy.
But even worse for Massino, Donnie Brasco's intel on the Bonnano family led to the indictment of 50 mobsters, including senior members of New York's 4 other mafia families. Massino wanted to rebuild the family with a reputation of secrecy, but now the other families only saw them as a liability. Former FBI Special Agent Jack Stubing.
The repercussions of the revelation that Donnie Brasco had infiltrated the family were staggering. the family was basically in chaos. The other four families treated the Bonannos like they were radioactive, and it caused a lot of ripple effect throughout the organized crime scene in New York. Well, there were significant prosecutions. I mean, the ultimate was the so-called commission case, in which they indicted the people who were believed to be the heads of the five families, and that was again a dramatic situation for the families.
The Mafia's main governing body, the Commission, cut the Bonannos out of all of their syndicated rackets. It was a devastating blow to Joe Massino. His reputation and his family's multi-million-dollar income were in the gutter. But for the FBI, it was a triumph. Former FBI Special Agent Pat Colgan was on the Bonnano squad.
Well, needless to say, the convictions of many of the Bonnano family members, including Joe Massino, was very satisfying to many law enforcement people who were involved in the investigations. But by no means did law enforcement think we had eradicated the entire crime problem. That was never the case. But it did have a detrimental effect on the organized crime family.
Yet one big fish had eluded their net. Somehow Massino's second-in-command, Salvatore Vitale, had escaped indictment and was still on the outside. The FBI suspected that Vitale was continuing the family business, so they began staking out his HQ. Over a few weeks, the FBI recorded enough evidence of racketeering to convict several members of Vitale's crew, but they fell short of catching the man himself. Jack Steubing, who headed the team, remembers the frustration.
We indicted several members and associates of the Bonnano family, but Sal Vitale wasn't one of them, although we had a microphone inside the club and actually a microphone outside the club, and we had CCTV inside the club. Vitale was not caught in the act of committing any criminal acts, and so he was never indicted as part of that investigation.
But because Joe Massino was behind bars, and now so many associates were out of action, it seemed as though the Bonnano family was done for good. The FBI shut down the Bonnano squad, and the agents were reassigned to other families.
Law enforcement has limited resources. They can only address so many problems at the same time, and with the outbreak simultaneously of the Colombo War, the combined resources of the squad that was now tasked with both the Bonnano and Colombo families were largely devoted to be taking care of the Colombo War.
The Colombo family had a history of fraught leadership, and they were once again killing each other. The FBI was tasked with containing it. Meanwhile, Joe Massino was determined to get back on his feet again. He began to rebuild his family and his reputation from behind bars, and he knew the person on the outside who could help him, Sal Vitale.
Well, Massino and Vitale were brothers-in-law. Vitale was married to Massino's sister. They had a very close relationship growing up. One of the stories that's often told about it is that Massino taught Vitale how to swim, for example, and was sort of a surrogate big brother, father to figure to Vitale.
And as Massino's literal family member, Sal Vitale was allowed to visit the boss in prison.
Joe Massino was, of course, allowed to have visitors wherever he physically was located at that time in the prison system. So Sal Vitale would visit him in jail. Joe Massino's wife would visit him in jail and be given coded type messages. Sal Vitale's wife would visit Joe Massino in jail and also be given coded messages transmitting back to Sal Vitale. Joe was still effectively the head of the Bonnano organized crime family, even though he was in jail. Sal Vitale was definitely effectively running the Bonnano organized crime family at Joe Massino's request.
The prison visits became Mafia meetings. With Massino's direction, Vitale slowly started rebuilding the Bonnano empire. But the exclusion of the family from large syndicated Mafia rackets meant their profits were low. Vitale was forced to start again from scratch.
There were always crews in the Bonnano family that were involved in narcotics trafficking, but they became a little more blatant about it.
They turned to dealing hard drugs to raise cash. But as drug use surged, it became a multi-million-dollar business. And the Bonnano family cashed in. The FBI had been concentrating on the other four families during that time. The rise from the ashes of the Bonannos flew under their radar.
There's very limited intelligence on the Bonnano family while Joe Massino was in jail.
So the family, during a really major crackdown by the FBI, the family was out of the loop.
Hey, listeners, I want to tell you about another podcast I think you might like. Uncover, Escaping NXIVM, takes you inside a bizarre self-help group that attracted actors, politicians, the super wealthy, and even a visit from the Dalai Lama. The series tells the story of one woman who went from being their star recruiter to leading the fight to take it down. Subscribe to Uncover, Escaping NXIVM on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get Mafia. When he was eventually released, Massino would be more powerful than ever. And ironically, it was Donnie Brasco that he'd have to thank for it. When Joseph Massino walked out of prison in November 1992, as far as the FBI were concerned, the crime boss and his family were not a threat. But thanks to Sal Vitale, Massino was once again the boss of a thriving Bonnano crime family. Crime author Selwyn Rabb.
He brought them back into stardom. They became probably, at one point, the most important family in New York for a variety of reasons, one of which was Massino's safeguards and his whole policy and his philosophy of making sure that the family would never be infiltrated again.
We had very poor informant coverage. The Bonannos didn't have anyone who had turned to become a government cooperator, and we were really starting from scratch. The cases that we had in the pipeline had been wrapped up, and we were entering the age of Massino, basically.
It wasn't long before the FBI heard rumors that he was back running the show. Restarting investigations into Bonnano activities, Jack Stubing made it a priority to gather as much new intelligence as he could.
Massino was the key to the family, so what I had to do was find the key to Massino.
Stubing's squad tried to put pressure on known informants to build a profile of his new associates.
One of the things that I've always preached in these kind of investigations is that you don't go head on for the main guy. You start probing around for who the weak spots are around him, because the guy who's at the top of the pyramid got there because he's got his wits about him. And so you're looking for somebody who's maybe not so sharp.
But the squad hit a brick wall. No one seemed to know what Massino and his men were up to, or no one was willing to talk. Massino had learned a valuable lesson in ensuring the loyalty of his soldiers. Bonannos were frightened for their lives. Nobody would say a word against him.
No one would talk to us about Joe Massino because they feared him. He was feared absolutely because he was a violent man, and his reputation preceded him. Joe Massino threatened people with death. That's a great motivator. And yes, everyone knew on the street that he was quite capable, quite lethal.
Despite round-the-clock surveillance of Massino's HQ, Stubing found it impossible to get anything on him or his soldiers.
Joe Massino would not speak in a group setting. If he wanted to talk criminal activity, he would walk outside with at least one person, maybe two. He would walk around the block. He would put his hands over his lips to avoid any type of recording that a lip reader could possibly translate. He would never use a telephone and talk substance of a criminal action or planning a criminal action. Joe Massino was very, very smart and discreet. He communicated face-to-face. He was very selective in who he did meet. He wouldn't just meet Tom, Dick, and Harry off the street. He had to know them or be assured by somebody else that this was a trusted person.
Joe Massino tried to figure out the mistakes everybody else had made in the other families and his own family. He built these protective walls. Nobody really spoke on the phone. Nobody spoke in clubhouses. They didn't exist anymore.
With his surveillance and wiretaps failing, Stubing had no choice but to go in and check out the scene himself.
My training in organized crime was always that you should try and get to know your adversaries personally. And I decided, this was shortly before I became the supervisor of the squad, to go out and visit him at his business and see what he was all about. He had a catering business out on Long Island called King Caterers, which was responsible for what were known as roach coaches, these trucks that visit construction sites and sell sandwiches and coffee to workers. And his trucks reportedly also provided services such as loan shark loans and taking bets.
Stubing turned up unannounced and headed inside the caterers, and he had no idea how the brutal crime boss might react.
So I visited Massino at his facility, and he was back in the kitchen making sauce or something. And then I took the approach with him that I had been watching him, which he, of course, knew. And I engaged him in conversation, and the approach that I had taken was that, I know you're trying to go straight and you're not in the life anymore and that kind of thing. And he knew I didn't believe it, and he didn't believe I believed it. But it gave us the opportunity to have a conversation because as much as I wanted to see what he was all about, he wanted to see what I was all about and what I knew.
Stubing realized that Massino's men had been watching his agents as much as his agents had been watching Massino.
He told me about surveillances that he had been the subject of, and I knew he knew what he was talking about because I'd been on some of those surveillances. He could physically describe agents. He knew what cars we drove. He had partial license plate numbers. He knew pretty much everything that was in our bag of tricks up to that time in investigating organized crime and what had been successful and what hadn't been successful. And it was clear that he was somebody that had his wits about him and was a master of his craft. And so anyway, when I was leaving him, we shook hands, and I said to him, maybe I'm just stupid, but we really haven't caught you doing anything. And he looked at me and he says, "You're not stupid." And I left, and I thought, neither are you.
Stubing had come out of the meeting unscathed, but now Massino knew where the FBI stood, and he tightened his security even further.
First of all, he abolished the idea that they would meet in social clubs, easy places to infiltrate and to conduct surveillances by the FBI and other agents. He also decided that he would create bulletproof situations. Each capo in his family, who he considered to be very loyal to him, would only know about one aspect of the family's wealth and operations. And he also determined every capo in the family should get his sons or near relatives made as inducted soldiers. The idea being that if you ratted, you endangered not just yourself, but your relatives, including your next of kin. So He tried to build these protective barriers and walls where nobody knew too much except him. And by this way, he determined that he wouldn't make the mistakes that other bosses have made, that trusting too many people and allowing somebody to infiltrate.
Here's why I'm a big fan of SimpliSafe Home Security. SimpliSafe is ready for anything that gets thrown at it. A storm takes out your power? SimpliSafe is ready. An intruder cuts your phone line? SimpliSafe is ready. But what if they disable your keypad or siren? SimpliSafe will get you the help you need. Sure, maybe it's overkill. Maybe you don't need to be ready for every worst-case scenario. But that's what makes SimpliSafe's home security system so great. It's always ready. So now you're thinking, that's cool, but SimpliSafe has got to cost an arm and a leg. But that's just it. It doesn't. They only charge you what's fair. 24/7 professional security monitoring is just $14.99 a month. $14.99! Now, ask yourself how much you spend on coffee every month. And they're so confident that you'll love it. There are no contracts and no hidden fees. I've got it set up in my living room, and not only is it fun to look at, I feel safer every time I pass by. I recommend SimpliSafe to everyone I know. You've got to check it out. Go to simplisafe.com/mafia today. That's simplisafe.com/mafia to protect your home and family today. simplisafe.com/mafia. With the FBI unable to make a move and his soldiers remaining loyal, Massino's crime empire continued to expand. At the same time, FBI investigations into the other families were reaping rewards. Lawyers prepared for what became known as the commission trials. These trials proved participation in huge syndicated rackets, worth tens of millions of dollars. The bosses of all four of the other New York Mafia families were sent to prison. For organized crime, it was a devastating blow. But for Joe Massino, it cleared the field. He was the last man standing, and so the FBI nicknamed him the Last Don.
Joe Massino was considered the last Don because he was really the last of the old guard, the only significant player left on the street.
And it was all thanks to Donnie Brasco.
In a way, Pistone did the Bonnano crime family a favor because the impact was to shield the family from involvement in any of the other major mafia rackets, because the family was shunned and the other families didn't want them involved. So the Bonnano family, had to go out and make its money its own way. And since it really insulated the family from scrutiny by federal authorities for the longest period of time.
By the mid-1990s, there was still a complete wall of silence surrounding Massino's soldiers. To the FBI, the Last Don seemed untouchable. But then Jack Stubing got lucky. A secret informant squealed, not on Massino himself, but his loyal number 2, Sal Vitale. It was the breakthrough he'd been waiting for. It turned out that Sal Vitale had been using a bank on Long Island to launder cash, as well as to extort gambling and loan sharking debts. Regular customers used the front entrance, but Sal Vitale used an entrance around the back. The FBI didn't hesitate. They moved in, indicting Vitale along with 6 of his associates and the bank's manager for racketeering. They had put Vitale behind bars, but couldn't yet tie anything back to Massino himself. However, Vitale was given an unusually short prison sentence, and it had an unexpected effect on the family, especially Joe Massino.
Vitale's trouble with the bank case on Long Island was something that created suspicion among other members of the crime family, not necessarily Massino at first, that Sal might be cooperating because he got a relatively light sentence. You know, some people in the world of the mafia, you get a light sentence. It could be just a fluke of the sentencing guidelines, but everybody gets paranoid and thinks that, well, maybe that's a sign that somebody's cooperating.
Gripped by paranoia, Massino didn't know what to do next. Vitali would be even more dangerous than Donnie Brasco. So dangerous that Massino might have to have his brother-in-law killed. In the next episode, their success with Vitali still didn't bring the FBI hope for taking down Joseph Massino, so they had to find alternate methods.
I became convinced more than ever that he knew so much about how we operated that we were going to have to try something that we hadn't tried before. He was certainly on red alert as far as any informants we could develop or penetrating with another undercover agent. He was certainly well aware of our surveillance techniques, and it was time for a new approach.
The feds tightened the screw on Massino's most loyal soldiers, making them flip one after the other and tell on their ruthless and brutal boss.
Weinberg was a very nervous guy. We did not think that he would be capable of spending any time in jail, and we figured if we targeted him, which we did, and we targeted him through a covert financial investigation, that if we arrested him, that he would cooperate with us and give us an inside look into the Bonnano organized crime family.
And in the end, Joe Massino was cornered to such an extent by the FBI that he did the unprecedented, what no other official mob boss had ever done before him.
The man who was against anybody talking now became the biggest blabbermouth, and he undid everything that he had created over 20 years.
This has been an Audio Boom and World Media Rights co-production, hosted by me, Fleet Cooper. It is produced by Audio Boom's Ben Hosley and Rachel Jacobs and Bettina Vasquez for World Media Rights. We had editing help from David Markowitz, with additional production from World Media Rights by Gerald Zibengwa. David McNabb is the series creative director, and the executive producers for Audio Boom are Brendan Reagan and Stuart Last. Thanks to Simply Safe and CBC's podcast Someone Knows Something for sponsoring this episode. Follow Mafia on Spotify, or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you find your favorite shows. And if you've got some time, give us a review.